They said she didn't belong. They mocked her dreams. From day one, Vivien Sanders faced skeptical looks and words dripping with prejudice. One small mistake, one complaint, and her career could vanish into thin air. But the most painful thing wasn't the scorn of passengers. It was the jealousy of her own colleagues. Alone in the sky, more isolated than ever, will Vivien keep flying, or will she crash under the weight of expectations? Atlanta on a June morning. The sky stretched wide and blue, sunlight spilling over bustling streets, glinting off the towering glass windows. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, birdsong blended with the faint crackle of an old radio in the Sanders kitchen. Vivien Sanders, 29, stood before the mirror, adjusting the collar of her blouse before heading out. Her mother, Harriet Sanders, set down her coffee cup, a gentle smile playing on her lips. "Today's an important day, isn't it?" Vivien nodded, her gaze steady, determined. "My first day of flight attendant training." Harriet stepped closer, resting a hand lightly on her daughter's shoulder. "You've always dreamed of flying. Don't let anything discourage you. Not even the words you don't want to hear." Vivien understood. As a Black woman stepping into the airline industry, she knew the looks, the whispers, the quiet dismissals that awaited her. But she was ready. The moment she walked into the airline's training facility, the reality became clear. She was one of the very few women of color in the room. The others, mostly white, slender, impeccably groomed, their blonde and chestnut hair neatly styled, chatted softly as they waited. Vivien inhaled deeply, straightened her spine, and approached the registration desk. The woman in charge, middle-aged, platinum blonde, her hair pulled into a severe bun, glanced up briefly before looking down at the list. Her voice was polite, yet tinged with something unmistakable. "Name? Vivien Sanders?" A pause, a flicker of hesitation. Her eyes swept over Vivien, then back to the roster. "Are you sure? I don't see a Sanders on today's list." Vivien arched a brow, but kept her tone composed. "I received a confirmation email. Perhaps you should check again." The woman turned a page, then another. Finally, she gave a small nod. "Ah, there you are. Didn't see it at first. You may go in." Vivien said nothing, only offering the faintest of smiles. She was used to moments like this, those split seconds where people seemed surprised to find her there. To survive in this industry, you must learn to please. The first training session took place in a grand lecture hall, where fresh recruits gathered around an older woman, Margaret Ellis, a veteran flight attendant with over 30 years of experience. Her uniform was pristine, her silver hair immaculately styled, her sharp eyes studying each trainee in turn. "Welcome to your flight attendant training. You were chosen because you meet our standards. But being chosen does not mean you will last." Vivien sat upright, absorbing every word. Ellis continued, her voice measured, commanding. "Your job is not simply to serve. We are the face of the airline, the ones who shape the passenger experience. And sometimes that means showing patience, even when respect is not given in return." She paused, scanning the room. Passengers can say whatever they wish. They may dislike how you look, how you speak, or even the fact that you are here at all. But if you want to survive in this business, you must learn to please, no matter what is said. Vivien held her gaze for the briefest of moments. There was something beneath those words, something meant specifically for her. Not just to please, but to earn respect. After the session, Vivien stepped into the hallway, where a group of trainees gathered in conversation. "I guess we'll have to smile even when someone yells in our face," a blonde girl mused, shaking her head with a chuckle. "It makes sense," another chimed in. "Passengers pay good money. They expect to be treated like royalty." Vivien lingered nearby, listening, observing. Then one of them, Grace Evans, tall, poised, exuding confidence, turned to her. "You're Vivien, right?" "That's right. Ever flown before?" "Not yet, but I've been preparing for this for a long time." Grace tilted her head, her smile laced with something unreadable. "Well then, good luck. Not everyone is cut out for this." She didn't say it outright. She didn't have to. Vivien had heard it before, felt it before. That quiet, unspoken question. "Do you belong here?" Vivien took a slow breath, then smiled back. Thanks, I'll do my best. She turned, walking away with a fire burning in her chest. She wasn't here just to please. She was here to be respected. Day 3 of training. The air in the training room felt heavier than usual. Rows of trainees sat in tense silence, their eyes fixed on the instructor demonstrating on a mock airplane cabin. Today's session was a crucial one, conflict resolution training, a test to see who truly had what it took to become a flight attendant. Vivien sat quietly, watching as each trainee stepped forward to take their turn. This exercise will simulate real-life scenarios on board, the instructor announced. Each of you will handle a difficult passenger. A few trainees looked nervous, but most were composed, ready for the challenge. When Grace Evans' name was called, she rose with effortless poise. The instructor took on the role of an irritable passenger, an elderly man grumbling about his seat, the food, and even the service. You think I paid for this seat just to sit on a rock-hard cushion? I demand to be moved, immediately. Grace's polished smile didn't waver. She bent slightly at the waist, her voice honeyed yet firm. Sir, I'm very sorry for the inconvenience. Let me check and see what I can do to make you more comfortable. The instructor continued to push, his complaints escalating, but Grace remained composed. She handled the test with ease, and when she finished, murmurs of approval rippled through the room. Then it was Vivien's turn. Are you sure you can handle this? She stepped forward, inhaling slowly. The instructor exchanged a glance with a middle-aged man standing nearby, one of the assistants who would be playing the role of her difficult passenger. Begin. Vivien smiled, approaching with steady confidence. Good afternoon, sir. How may I assist you? The man crossed his arms, looking her up and down, his expression unreadable. You can assist me by finding another flight attendant. His voice was cold, deliberate. The room went still. A few trainees exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. Vivien straightened her posture. She had expected moments like this, just not this soon. I'd be more than happy to assist you, sir, she replied evenly. I am the flight attendant available to you right now, and I want to make sure you have a comfortable flight. The man raised an eyebrow, clearly displeased with her refusal to retreat. Oh, really? Then bring me a glass of water, without spilling it all over me like some clumsy idiot. Her smile remained, but there was a new sharpness to it. I assure you, sir, your water will be served perfectly. Turning on her heel, she mimed pouring a drink from the practice cart, then returned, placing the imaginary glass before him with careful precision. The man lifted the invisible glass, staring at her as if waiting for her to falter. This will do, he said at last, offering no thanks. The instructor nodded. That's enough. You may step down. Vivien walked back to her seat, faint whispers trailing behind her. Some looked at her with quiet sympathy. Others merely shrugged. What had just happened wasn't unexpected. She wasn't here to prove anything to them. When the session ended, Vivien stood by the window, watching the golden sunlight spill over the glass buildings in the distance. The day had left a weight in her chest, but she wasn't going to let it settle. You okay? She turned. Lisa Carter, fiery red hair, warm smile, stood beside her, arms crossed. I'm fine, Vivien said. Lisa leaned against the window frame. That was ridiculous. I mean, why pull something like that in training? Vivien shrugged. Maybe that was the real test. To see if I'd stay calm, Lisa huffed out a quiet laugh. Well, you passed. But listen, don't let stuff like that get to you. I think you're going to be a damn good flight attendant. Vivien turned to her, taking in the sincerity in Lisa's eyes. Then she smiled. Thanks. I think so too. Today had been tough. But Vivien hadn't come here to prove anything to them. She was here for herself, and she wasn't going to let anyone stand in the way of what she was meant to become. Morning. Vivien stood before the mirror, adjusting her crisp, brand-new uniform. The pristine white blouse lay smooth against her skin, the navy blue scarf at her neck shifting ever so slightly with each breath. She took a deep inhale, straightened her posture, and reminded herself, this is the first day. There is no room for mistakes. Her mother, Harriet, lingered at the doorway, a gentle smile on her lips. Vivien? Are you ready? Vivien turned, her eyes steady, unwavering. More than ever, Mom. Harriet stepped forward, placing both hands on her daughter's shoulders. I'm proud of you. No matter what happens, remember, you belong there. Let them see how strong you are. Vivien squeezed her mother's hands lightly, saying nothing, but she knew. Today was not just another workday. This was the first step toward the dream she had carried since childhood. No one expects perfection on the first day. The crew lounge buzzed with lively chatter. Flight attendants, clad in impeccable uniforms, exchanged schedules and flight details. Some were familiar with one another, their conversations easy and flowing. Others, like Vivien, were still finding their footing. A voice rang out behind her. Welcome to your first day, Sanders. She turned to see Daniel Carter, today's lead flight attendant. He was middle-aged, calm, composed, his graying hair neatly styled, his voice deep and reassuring. I'm Daniel, your purser. You'll be working economy class today. Vivien nodded, shaking his firm, steady hand. Looking forward to it. Daniel offered a small, knowing smile. Just take it slow, observe everything, and remember, no one expects perfection on the first day. The most important thing is keeping your composure. She nodded again, his words settling something within her. Nearby, Lisa Carter, petite, red-haired, and effortlessly warm, gave Vivien a friendly wave. Vivien, right? We trained together. Vivien recognized her immediately, one of the few who had been kind from the start. She smiled back. That's right. It's great to be working with you. Not everyone was as welcoming. Across the room, Grace Evans, the trainee who had been less than friendly during training, glanced over but said nothing, turning away without a word. Vivien didn't dwell on it. She hadn't come here seeking anyone's approval. She had come here to work. The team moved toward the gate. As they stepped onto the plane, a wave of anticipation swelled inside Vivien. The scent of the cabin, leather seats, fresh plastic, the faint aroma of coffee from first class. It all felt strangely right. She and Lisa were assigned to check the seating area, ensuring everything was in place before boarding. As they fastened seat belts and inspected overhead bins, Lisa leaned in with a knowing smile. Nervous? Vivien exhaled slowly, answering honestly. Of course, but I think I'm ready. Lisa nodded. Good. Just remember, no matter what happens, stay calm. The passengers look to us to know if they should be worried. Daniel's voice cut through the chatter, gathering the team's focus. All right, everyone. To the passengers, we are the face of this airline. If we stay professional, they feel safe. If we lose control, they panic. So, no matter what happens, keep it together. Vivien took a steady breath. She understood now. This was more than a service job. It was a performance in composure. Welcome aboard. As the first passengers stepped onto the plane, Vivien stood beside Lisa, offering warm smiles. Welcome aboard. Most passengers returned the greeting with a polite nod or a quick smile. Others were preoccupied, checking their phones, engaged in conversation. Then, a middle-aged woman with platinum hair and sharp eyes approached. She glanced at Vivien, pausing for the briefest moment, just long enough for a flicker of disapproval to register in her expression. She said nothing, adjusted her handbag, walked past. Vivien didn't react, her practiced smile never wavering. She had seen that look before, the one that questioned you, a flight attendant. Beside her, Lisa nudged her arm lightly. Let it go. Not worth it. Vivien let out a soft breath, forcing a small chuckle. I know. It's just, she didn't finish the sentence. Lisa understood. A few moments later, an elderly couple approached. The man, silver-haired with kind eyes, stopped just before stepping past her. Well, hello, young lady. First day on the job? Vivien blinked, a little surprised, then smiled. Yes, sir. The old man grinned. Well then, best of luck to you. I have a feeling you're going to do just fine. Warmth spread through her chest. Not everyone looked at her with doubt. Some still believed. Once the last passenger was seated, the aircraft doors shut. Daniel signaled for the crew to prepare for the safety demonstration. Vivien took her place in the aisle, inhaling deeply as she positioned her hands. These motions, these practiced gestures, she had done them hundreds of times in training. But this time, It wasn't a drill. This was real. Her voice was steady. Her hands didn't tremble. And as the aircraft taxied down the runway, Vivien felt it. A quiet, unwavering pride. Today, she wasn't just dreaming of flying. Today, she flew. The flight continued in silence. Passengers had settled in, the soft amber glow of the cabin lights casting a warm hush over the space. Vivien moved with quiet precision, checking each row, ensuring that everyone was comfortable. She stopped at 18C. The middle-aged man from earlier still held his newspaper, but his expression had softened. He no longer carried the rigid discontent from before. Sensing her presence, he glanced up. A moment of silence. Vivien kept her polite smile in place, expecting nothing more. She had done her job. That was enough. Finally, the man slowly folded his newspaper, cleared his throat, and spoke. "You're very professional." His voice was lower now, the sharp edges dulled. "I was a little out of line earlier." Vivien met his gaze, surprised but careful not to show it. A small acknowledgement, but an acknowledgement nonetheless. "Thank you, sir. I only want to make sure your flight is a pleasant one." The man gave a small nod before returning to his magazine. No further words were needed. Vivien knew she had handled it right. Sometimes, action is the best response. Back in the galley, Lisa Carter greeted her with a bright grin. "You just pulled off something not everyone can do." Vivien raised an eyebrow, setting down an empty tray. "What do you mean?" Lisa crossed her arms, leaning against the counter. "Not everyone stays that composed when they're treated unfairly. Most people would get irritated, or at least show it a little." Vivien took a sip of water, considering her words before answering. "I've learned that sometimes the best response isn't arguing. It's action." Lisa nodded in approval, then let out a small laugh. "You should write a book on patience." Vivien chuckled, but as she turned, her gaze met Grace Evans standing near the galley entrance. Grace wasn't smiling. She wasn't rolling her eyes or making a comment. Instead, she simply watched, as if trying to understand something about Vivien that she couldn't quite grasp. Vivien didn't look away. She only gave a slight nod before returning to work. She didn't need immediate acceptance from everyone. What mattered was that she was moving forward. Good luck with this job. As the plane touched down at LaGuardia Airport, New York, passengers began gathering their belongings, filing toward the exit. Vivien stood by the door, offering polite smiles to each person as they disembarked. The man from 18C passed by, but this time he paused. "Good luck with this job." Vivien blinked. A word of encouragement? She hadn't expected that from him. "Thank you, sir. Have a wonderful day." He gave a small nod before stepping off the plane. A moment later, Daniel Carter appeared beside her, his presence steady as always. "I saw how you handled that situation earlier." Vivien turned, bracing herself for critique. But instead, Daniel smiled. "You were very professional. Not many people can stay that composed on their first day." Warmth spread through her chest. "Thank you, Daniel. I was just following what I was taught." He nodded. "Keep it up. You have real potential, Vivien." This was just the beginning. Stepping off the aircraft, she inhaled deeply, the crisp New York air brushing against her skin. Her first flight was over. It wasn't perfect. She had made mistakes. She had been tested. But she had also learned something invaluable. Respect isn't given on demand. It's earned through action, through perseverance. Adjusting the strap of her bag, Vivien lifted her gaze to the sky. This was just the beginning. Chicago's sky was a clear, endless blue as Flight AA 792 prepared for takeoff to Seattle. In the galley, Vivien Sanders checked the serving trays one last time. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, instructing the cabin crew to take their positions. She took a steady breath, her composure firm, yet a trace of unease lingered beneath it. This wasn't her first flight, but it was the longest one since she had officially started her career. "It'll be fine," she reminded herself, stealing a brief glance out the window. Daniel Carter, the lead flight attendant, stood in the galley, his usual calm presence grounding the crew. He held a printed flight report, his voice level and authoritative. "We're expecting light to moderate turbulence as we pass through a low-pressure system near Montana. Make sure everything is secured properly." Vivien listened intently, nodding. She had already reviewed the weather report before the flight, but hearing Daniel confirm it made the tension settle just a little deeper. Beside her, Lisa Carter offered a reassuring smile. "Relax. We've trained for this." Vivien returned the smile, though she said nothing. Daniel continued, "We have a few passengers who may require extra attention today. A young mother traveling with an infant, a high-strung businessman prone to complaints, and an elderly passenger with a reputation for being difficult. If anyone becomes distressed during turbulence, stay calm and handle it accordingly." Vivien committed each detail to memory. "Understood, Chief. You worry too much, Vivien." After the briefing, the crew dispersed to make final preparations. As Vivien secured the seat belts in the first row, a voice drifted beside her. "You worry too much, Vivien." She turned to see Grace Evans, arms crossed, a flicker of amusement in her eyes. Vivien straightened her posture, her expression unreadable. "I just want to make sure everything goes smoothly." Grace shrugged, a smirk playing at her lips. "It's just a little turbulence. Nothing to stress over." Vivien didn't respond. She knew Grace still didn't take her seriously, but that didn't matter. Her job was to focus. The flight begins. The aircraft taxied onto the runway, engines roaring as it gathered speed. Vivien took her designated position, inhaled deeply, and closed her eyes for a moment. "God is with me. Let me do my duty well." A powerful rush of sound filled the cabin as the plane lifted off the ground. Vivien opened her eyes, watching the city shrink beneath them. The flight had officially begun. What she didn't know was that the storm ahead would be the greatest test she had ever faced. A Boeing 737 sliced through the white expanse of clouds, leaving a faint trail of vapor in its wake. Inside the cabin, everything remained calm. Some passengers had their eyes closed, resting, while others were absorbed in the glow of their seatback screens. Vivien moved down the aisle, methodically checking on each row. She stopped at 14B, where a young mother was gently rocking her baby, no more than a year old, who clung to her shirt, crying softly. "She's a little scared of flying," the mother said with a weary smile. Vivien knelt slightly, her voice warm. "Is this her first time on a plane?" The woman nodded. Vivien understood. She remembered her own first flight as a child. The strange, weightless sensation, the mix of excitement and nerves. "Is there anything I can do to help?" "I think she just needs time to adjust." Vivien nodded, then reached for a paper cup, pouring a small amount of warm water. She handed it to the mother with a reassuring smile. A little warm water might help her feel more at ease. "Let me know if you need anything else." The mother gave a grateful nod, but before Vivien could stand, a sharp ding sounded overhead. The seatbelt sign illuminated, followed by the captain's steady voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are approaching an area of significant turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." A shift in the air, a sudden heaviness pressing down. Vivien hurried back to the galley, securing loose items as the first tremors shook the aircraft. Then the plane jolted hard. A few passengers gasped. Whispers of unease spread through the cabin. Vivien glanced at the small round window in the galley door. The sky outside was no longer serene. Thick, gray storm clouds churned, swallowing the light. Another jolt. Harder this time. A beverage cart in first class rattled against the floor. Vivien instinctively checked her own seatbelt, then looked to Lisa Carter. Her colleague clutched the side of her jump seat, eyes tense. "This is worse than I thought," Lisa murmured. Vivien nodded, but forced herself to stay steady. "God is with me. Let me stay calm." She pushed away the creeping fear and stepped out of the galley, scanning the cabin for anyone still unsecured. "Sir, you need to fasten your seatbelt. Now." At 16D, a businessman with his laptop balanced on his knees was still typing, completely ignoring the warning. Vivien leaned in, her voice firm but professional. "Sir, please fasten your seatbelt immediately." The man barely glanced up, irritation flickering across his face. "I need to finish this report. It's just a little turbulence." Before Vivien could respond, the plane lurched violently. The man's coffee spilled over his lap. "Damn it," he cursed, But this time, he didn't argue when Vivien reached down and secured his belt. A cry in the storm. From 14B, the baby's cries had escalated into full-blown wails. The mother rocked her desperately, but the child was inconsolable. Around them, other passengers shifted uncomfortably, their unease growing. Vivien didn't hesitate. She knelt beside them, her voice gentle. "Sweetheart, you're okay. The plane is just playing a little bouncing game." The baby kept crying. Vivien placed a reassuring hand over the mother's, then softly began to sing, a lullaby her mother had sung to her as a child. "Hush, little one, don't be afraid. For God is watching over you. Through storm and winds, through night and day. His love will see you through." At first, only her voice carried through the trembling cabin. Then slowly, the baby's cries softened. Passengers nearby began to relax. Some closed their eyes, soothed by the melody. A few exchanged quiet glances, their tension easing. A woman from a few rows back murmured, "That girl has a gift." Vivien kept singing until the baby drifted into sleep. Then everything changed. Just as she thought the worst had passed, the aircraft plunged. A hard, stomach-turning drop. Screams erupted. A man who hadn't secured his seatbelt was flung from his seat, crashing into the aisle. Vivien barely had time to think. Ignoring the shouts around her, she moved. She fought against the tremors, gripping on his seat backs to keep her balance as she rushed toward the fallen passenger. "Is she crazy?" someone gasped. Vivien didn't care. She dropped to her knees beside the man, grabbing his wrist, checking his pulse. "Sir, can you hear me?" His breathing was shallow, his hands trembling. "I didn't think it would be this bad," he stammered. "You're okay. Let's get you back to your seat." With quiet strength, Vivien helped him up, guiding him carefully. This time, she made sure his seatbelt was secure. Then, she lifted her gaze toward the ceiling, toward the unseen heavens beyond the storm. A silent prayer. "Lord, help me get them through this." The turbulence had eased, but the weight of the moment still lingered. Vivien felt her heartbeat slowly return to normal, yet she remained alert, scanning the cabin to ensure every passenger was safe. The elderly man who had fallen was now back in his seat, his face still pale from the shock. Vivien knelt beside him, her voice gentle. "Are you all right, sir?" He cleared his throat, nodding stiffly. "Didn't think I'd be so careless." "Thank you, miss." Vivien offered a reassuring smile. "Vivien Sanders, sir." He met her gaze, and this time, there was no irritation, no skepticism, only quiet recognition. "You handled that well. I owe you an apology. I may have been a little harsh earlier." Vivien rested a light hand on the armrest beside him. "There's nothing to apologize for, sir. What matters is that you're safe now." He studied her for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. For the first time since the flight began, he looked at ease. Acknowledgement from above. As the aircraft finally broke free from the storm, a soft ding echoed through the cabin, an incoming message from the cockpit. The captain's voice filled the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have successfully cleared the turbulence and are now back on course. Thank you for your patience. And I'd like to extend special recognition to Flight Attendant Vivien Sanders for her calm and professionalism throughout the situation." Vivien blinked, momentarily stunned. She hadn't realized the captain had been paying attention. A few scattered claps echoed through the cabin, then grew into a full round of applause. Some passengers turned toward her, nodding in appreciation. Lisa Carter nudged her playfully, grinning. "Look at you, getting a shout-out from the captain." Vivien let out a small, breathy laugh, warmth spreading through her chest. "Not bad, Sanders." Later, after meal service had been completed, Vivien returned to the galley to check on the carts. As she reached for a glass of water, a familiar voice sounded behind her. "Not bad, Sanders." She turned to find Grace Evans, arms crossed, her sharp demeanor noticeably softened. Vivien raised an eyebrow. "Did you just compliment me?" Grace smirked, shaking her head. "Don't let it go to your head. But, I'll admit, you handled things well." Vivien met her gaze, unwavering. She didn't need Grace's approval to validate her abilities, but hearing it from someone who once doubted her, felt like a small but significant victory. "Thank you, Grace." Grace gave a small nod before walking away. No more words, but something between them had shifted. Vivien smiled. Belonging. As the plane touched down at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, passengers slowly began filing out. Some paused to smile at Vivien, others nodded in quiet gratitude. A few even took the time to thank her personally before stepping off the aircraft. Standing by the exit, Vivien gripped the edge of her apron, letting it all sink in. She belonged here. Daniel Carter, ever composed, approached her as the last passengers departed. "Well done, Vivien. You have the makings of an excellent flight attendant." She turned to him, her gaze steady, her voice firm. "Thank you, Daniel. I'll keep working hard." Daniel nodded approvingly before stepping aside. Vivien took a deep breath, looking out at the vast Seattle sky beyond the jet bridge. Today she had been tested. Today she had proved something to herself more than anyone. And she knew, without a doubt, this was only the beginning. The plane touched down at Los Angeles International Airport after a smooth flight. Passengers disembarked, carrying with them murmured thank yous and relieved smiles. Vivien Sanders stood by the exit, her professional smile in place, just as always. But this time, something felt different. Not from the passengers, from her colleagues. Something was off. In the crew lounge, Vivien pulled out a chair and sat down. The familiar space suddenly felt stifling. Lisa Carter, her closest friend on the crew, slid a can of fruit juice in her hand and whispered, "Tell me you feel it too." Vivien took a sip, nodding slightly. "I do, but I can't quite place it." Lisa's gaze flicked toward the far corner of the room, where a small group of flight attendants were deep in conversation. Their voices were low, but every so often, their eyes darted toward her. Vivien wasn't paranoid. She knew when she was being watched. A few seats away, Grace Evans sat with her arms folded, listening to the hushed whispers around her. She's really lucky. Not even a full month in, and she's already getting praise from the captain, right? He almost never does that. What's so special about her? Grace didn't respond, but her expression hardened. She had been with the airline longer than Vivien. She had expected herself to be the one getting noticed. And yet it was Vivien's name that everyone was talking about. "Daniel Carter seems to favor her too," another attendant murmured. Daniel Carter, their lead flight attendant, the one who had been entrusting Vivien with more and more responsibilities lately. Grace's lips curled slightly. Her tone was smooth, but cool. "Let's see if she's really as good as everyone says she is." The first warning. Hours later, as the crew prepared for their next flight, Vivien and Grace were assigned to check the passenger cabin together. Vivien bent down to inspect the seatbelts in the first row. As she straightened, Grace brushed past her, just hard enough to make a point. "Careful there, Sanders," Grace murmured. Not sharp, not outright hostile, but enough. Vivien met her gaze, steady and unreadable. She knew workplace tensions were inevitable. She had no interest in making them worse. Lisa, watching from nearby, exhaled quietly. "You should brace yourself. Not everyone's happy about the attention you're getting." Vivien wasn't surprised, but she couldn't control what other people thought. The only thing she could do was keep doing her job. The other kind of storm, as the plane taxied toward the runway, Vivien felt the pressure shift around her. It wasn't the flight. It was the turbulence brewing within the crew itself. She took a slow, deliberate breath, grounding herself. "Lord, help me stay calm. Help me do my job." Because she knew the storms inside people's hearts were always harder to predict than the ones in the sky. The Boeing 737 glided smoothly across the sky, leaving behind faint white trails. Inside the passenger cabin, everything seemed normal. But in the galley, tension between Vivien Sanders and Grace Evans was steadily building. Vivien could feel it. There were no casual work conversations. No effortless teamwork like she had with other colleagues. Only cool glances and a growing sense of distance. She didn't want to make a big deal out of it. She believed that, given time, Grace would realize she was not the enemy. But then, something happened that changed everything. A situation unfolds. About an hour after takeoff, Voices began to rise in economy class. You spilled water all over my shirt. I already apologized. What more do you want? Two men, both growing increasingly agitated. Nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably, turning to watch. Vivien and Grace heard it at the same time. They both moved. Vivien approached calmly, lowering herself slightly to their eye level, her voice composed. Gentlemen, how can I assist you? The man with the wet shirt huffed, still bristling. He doesn't know how to keep to his space. Look at this. My tie is ruined. Vivien glanced at the fabric. A small water stain. Nothing severe. But she understood, on a plane, emotions had a way of escalating. Before she could say another word, Grace stepped forward. Her voice was clipped firm. Sir, we can't help you if you keep raising your voice. Vivien tensed. It was too direct. Not the right approach for this moment. The man's face darkened, his frustration spiking instead of diffusing. He gestured abruptly, knocking over a nearby cup of water. The liquid spilled onto the aisle, sending a few startled passengers pulling back. Vivien knew what was about to happen. If they didn't handle this correctly, it could spiral into a full-blown conflict. Without a word, she reached out and placed a light hand on Grace's shoulder, a silent signal to step back. Then, she turned back to the man, retrieving a clean napkin from her apron pocket and setting it gently on the tray table in front of him. I truly apologize for the inconvenience. Let me bring you a warm towel and a fresh drink. No accusations. No confrontation. Just professionalism and control. The man hesitated. His anger faltered, giving way to something almost like realization. A long exhale. Fine. I just got a little worked up. I understand. Long flights can be exhausting. Vivien's voice remained soft, steady. She handed him the napkin. He took it without another word. A different kind of turbulence. When the situation was settled, Vivien returned to the galley. Grace was already there, waiting. Arms crossed, eyes sharp. You think you handled that well, don't you? Vivien exhaled slowly, setting down an empty tray. Grace, I was just doing my job. No, Grace's voice was tight. You corrected me. Right in front of passengers. Vivien frowned. That wasn't my intention. Well, that's what happened. Grace's gaze didn't waver. You wanted to look perfect, didn't you? Wanted to show them you're better than me? Something in Vivien's chest tightened. A flicker of irritation for the first time. She met Grace's stare directly. I never thought that. But if staying calm means trying to be perfect to you, maybe you should rethink that. The silence in the galley thickened. Then Lisa Carter stepped in, immediately sensing the charged atmosphere. What's going on here? Grace didn't answer. She simply glanced at Vivien one last time, then turned on her heel and walked away. Lisa watched her go, then turned back. I think you just pissed her off. Vivien leaned against the counter, closing her eyes briefly. She didn't want enemies, but she also knew not everyone would accept her right away. Lord, give me the patience to get through this. The Boeing 737 soared through the sky, leaving faint white trails in its wake. Inside the cabin, the flight remained uneventful. But then, a tense voice cut through the air from the front of the aircraft. What's wrong with that passenger? Vivien turned sharply. Up in business class, a middle-aged man in a gray suit gripped the armrest, his face pale, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. Grace was already beside him, but something in her stance, the slight hesitation in her hands, gave her away. I think he's having a drop in blood pressure, she said, holding a glass of water but unsure of what to do next. Vivien didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, placing a steady hand on the man's shoulder. Sir, are you feeling dizzy? Short of breath? A weak nod. Vivien turned to Grace, her voice firm yet measured. We need to lower his head and elevate his legs slightly. Grace, can you grab a cold towel for me? For a second, Grace didn't move. Then, she gave a quick nod and went to retrieve it. Vivien knelt beside the man, her tone calm, reassuring. Just breathe slowly, sir. We'll help you feel better soon. She adjusted his posture, pressing the cold towel against his forehead and neck, signaling another crew member to bring sugar water. Within minutes, his color began to return. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their descent in 30 minutes, with medical personnel waiting on the ground. The man exhaled, exhaustion softening his expression. You're incredibly calm. Vivien smiled. Just doing what I'm trained to do, sir. Beside her, Grace watched the entire exchange, her expression unreadable. A different kind of truce. After landing, as the crew finished their final duties, Vivien was in the galley, checking the carts when she heard footsteps approaching. She turned. Grace stood there, holding 2 cups of coffee. Vivien hesitated for only a moment before accepting the cup offered to her. You want one? Grace asked, her voice neutral but lighter. Vivien studied her, then smiled softly. Thanks. For a moment, they stood there, silent. Then, Grace spoke first. You were good back there. Vivien placed her coffee down, her voice steady. I was just doing my job. No, Grace shook her head. You weren't just handling the situation. You made people feel safe. Vivien took a sip of coffee, then answered thoughtfully. My mother used to tell me something. We can't always control what happens around us, but we can control how we respond to it. Grace was quiet for a beat, then let out a small, dry chuckle. That definitely sounds like a mom thing to say. Vivien smiled. It is. And honestly, when I first started this job, I was terrified, but I learned something. If I let fear take over, I won't be able to help anyone. Grace studied her for a long moment, then let out a slow breath. I guess I was wrong about you. Vivien didn't say anything right away. She didn't need an apology. Sometimes a single action like offering a cup of coffee spoke louder than words ever could. She tilted her head slightly. You know, I think we could make a pretty good team. Grace blinked, then smirked. We'll see, Sanders. Vivien took another sip of coffee, warmth spreading through her chest, not just from the drink, but from something else. She knew that not everyone would accept her immediately. But today, she proved something. Trust isn't demanded. It's built. And she had taken the first step. Some storms happened in the sky. Others happened between people. Today, Vivien had weathered both. Vivien Sanders never thought a single phone call could change her life. That morning, she had just returned from a long-haul flight from New York to Chicago. While gathering her belongings in the crew lounge, her phone buzzed. Daniel Carter, lead flight attendant. Vivien frowned slightly. A direct call from Daniel? That wasn't typical. Sanders speaking. Daniel's voice came through, steady as always, but there was a weight to it this time. Vivien, a pause. I have a big opportunity for you. Vivien sat up straight. What kind of opportunity? The airline is organizing a high-profile flight to Geneva. It's carrying top executives, diplomats, and government officials for an international summit. Her pulse quickened. And you're telling me this because I want you to serve as the temporary lead flight attendant for the trip. For a moment, the world went still. Daniel kept talking, but her mind was still trying to catch up. We need someone who can maintain professionalism and composure under pressure. Based on what I've seen from you lately, I believe you're the right fit. Vivien pressed her lips together, her thoughts racing. She had been a flight attendant for nearly a year, but she had never expected an opportunity like this to come so soon. Daniel seemed to sense her hesitation. I know this is a lot, he said, but I wouldn't ask you if I didn't think you could handle it. So, do you want it? Vivien closed her eyes for a second and took a deep breath. This flight could define her career, but it also came with immense responsibility. If she failed, no, she couldn't let herself think like that. She had come too far to back down now. She remembered every struggle, the skeptical looks, the whispered doubts from colleagues, the trials she had faced in the air. She had fought for her place here, and now it was time to prove she belonged. Vivien opened her eyes, her voice clear, unwavering. I'll do it, Daniel. You're leading the Geneva flight? When Vivien told the crew about her decision, Lisa Carter was the first to react. Lisa's jaw dropped. Wait, what? You're leading the Geneva flight? Vivien chuckled at her friend's disbelief, nodding. I still can't believe it myself. Lisa practically launched herself at Vivien, pulling her into a tight hug. I told you from the start, you have leadership in you, and now the airline sees it too. But not everyone shared Lisa's enthusiasm. From across the lounge, A few flight attendants exchanged whispers, their eyes flickering toward Vivien with thinly veiled skepticism. She's barely been here a year, and she's already getting lead roles? Does she even have enough experience for this? Vivien heard every word, but she didn't let it faze her. She couldn't control their opinions. The only thing she could control was how she proved herself. An unexpected encounter. As she stepped out of the lounge, she nearly bumped into someone. Grace Evans. Vivien braced herself for a sarcastic remark, but Grace simply folded her arms, tilting her head slightly. Lead flight attendant, huh? Vivien met her gaze evenly. Just temporary. Grace was silent for a moment. Then, to Vivien's surprise, a small smirk tugged at her lips. You've gone further than I expected, Sanders. Vivien raised an eyebrow. Should I take that as a compliment? Grace let out a short, quiet laugh, without the usual bite. You can take it however you want. Then she turned and walked away. Vivien watched her go, knowing that things had shifted. No apology, no grand acknowledgement, but they were no longer rivals. The night before, that night, Vivien sat alone in her small Chicago apartment, staring out at the darkened skyline. Tomorrow, she would step onto the most important flight of her career. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. Lord, I don't know what awaits me, but I know. I'm ready. She opened her eyes. Determination burned in them. Tomorrow wouldn't be easy, but she had faced challenges before, and she would rise to meet them again. Flight AA 2908 from Chicago to Geneva lifted off in the late afternoon. The fiery hues of sunset washing over the wings as the plane ascended from the runway. Vivien Sanders stood tall in business class, her sharp eyes scanning the cabin, ensuring that everything was running smoothly. This was the most significant flight of her career, the first time she bore full responsibility as lead flight attendant. The business cabin was packed. Diplomats, executives, and influential figures from around the world filled the seats. Vivien could feel the weight of expectation in the air. This wasn't just another flight. This was a floating meeting ground for power. Daniel Carter wasn't on board. She was completely on her own. Lisa Carter gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder before heading to serve meals. You good? Vivien smiled, though her pulse was faster than usual. I'm good. Let's do this. Lisa nodded, but before walking away, she murmured, You were made for this, Vivien. Crisis at 36,000 feet. 3 hours into the flight, everything seemed to be going well, until a sharp, urgent call came from the business class cabin. Vivien moved fast. At seat 2A, a distinguished-looking elderly man in a black suit clutched his chest, his face contorted in pain. A heart attack. Vivien didn't panic. She had trained for this. Kneeling beside him, her voice was calm but firm. Sir, do you have a history of heart disease? Do you have medication with you? The man struggled to speak, his breath shallow, labored. His assistant, frantic, fumbled with a small pill case. He has a history. This is his nitroglycerin. Vivien acted immediately. She took a pill and slipped it under the man's tongue. But his condition didn't improve right away. Lisa appeared beside her, worry creeping into her voice. Vivien, should we notify the captain for an emergency landing? Vivien knew an emergency landing over the Atlantic Ocean wasn't a decision to make lightly. She had to assess carefully. Lisa, give me the oxygen tank. Grace, contact the captain. Let them know we have a passenger with a cardiac emergency and request medical consultation from the ground. Grace didn't question her. Not this time. She nodded and moved. Vivien kept her voice steady as she reassured the man while Lisa placed the oxygen mask over his nose. Slow breath, sir. We're taking care of you. 2 agonizing minutes passed. The man still looked weak, but his breathing was stabilizing. Then, a soft ding echoed over the intercom. Grace returned. Captain says we can reach the nearest airport in 40 minutes. A medical team is already on standby. Vivien nodded. We'll keep him stable until we land. Then she turned to Grace. Thank you. Grace paused for a moment, then gave a small nod. No problem, lead. And for the first time, there was no rivalry in her voice. Only trust. As the plane touched down in Geneva, Medical personnel boarded swiftly to tend to the diplomat. Before he was escorted off, the man reached for Vivien's hand. You're the reason I'm still alive. Vivien gave a soft, reassuring smile. I was just doing my job, sir. The man studied her for a long moment, then spoke, his voice weaker but filled with conviction. No, you did far more than that. You're a true leader. A warmth spread through Vivien's chest. She didn't need a title to prove her capabilities, but hearing someone else recognize it, that meant something. When everything had settled, the crew gathered in the galley for a post-flight debrief. A message from Daniel Carter had been left for her over the intercom. A congratulations. Lisa nudged her playfully. You just led an entire crew like a damn pro. Vivien simply smiled. Then, she looked at Grace. For a moment, Grace said nothing. Then, after a beat, she nodded. You did good, Sanders. Vivien raised an eyebrow. Should I take that as a compliment? Grace smirked, this time without a hint of sarcasm. Yeah, and this time I mean it. Vivien let out a quiet laugh. For the first time, she truly felt like she belonged. As she stepped off the aircraft, the crisp Geneva air brushed against her skin. She had faced her biggest test yet. She had not only proven herself, she had become someone her crew trusted. And she knew this was only the beginning. When the plane touched down in Geneva, Vivien exhaled slowly. The flight had been a success, not just because there had been no major incidents, but because she had proven herself. At the aircraft door, an elderly diplomat paused before stepping off. He offered her a warm smile. You are the reason we felt at ease this entire flight. You have all the qualities of a true leader. Vivien blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the praise. Thank you, sir. I was simply doing my duty. The man shook his head slightly. No, you did far more than that. Vivien bowed her head in appreciation. An unexpected promotion. Once the crew had completed their post-flight duties, Vivien was summoned to the airline's executive lounge at the airport. The CEO himself was waiting. Ms. Sanders, he greeted her with a smile. Today, you didn't just represent our airline. You embodied excellence in aviation. Vivien kept her posture composed, though a quiet sense of pride stirred in her chest. Thank you, sir. I simply did my best. The CEO nodded. And that's exactly why I'm pleased to inform you that you are being officially promoted to lead flight attendant. Vivien froze. She hadn't expected this, not so soon. I'm honored. The CEO's smile widened. You've proven that you deserve it. The people who matter. As she stepped out of the lounge, Lisa and Grace were already waiting. Lisa let out an excited shriek. You're officially lead now? Vivien nodded, smiling. Lisa threw her arms around her. Grace stood back, arms crossed, studying Vivien for a moment. Then, she gave a small nod. You did good, Sanders. Vivien looked between them, feeling something warm and steady settle inside her. She had come so far, from the young black woman who had been doubted, tested, pushed to prove herself, to a leader, recognized by both her colleagues and superiors. She lifted her gaze toward the endless blue Geneva sky and took a deep breath. Her journey wasn't over, but from this moment on, she knew she would always rise, not just in the sky, but in her career, in her life. Vivien Sanders' story is a reflection of a universal truth in modern life. Perseverance, resilience, and unwavering professionalism can break through prejudice and lead to the success one truly deserves. In today's workplace, recognition isn't always immediate. There will be skeptical glances, unfair challenges, and even ruthless competition. Some will question your place, your abilities, your right to be there. But instead of faltering, be like Vivien. Focus on your skills. Hold fast to your integrity. Prove your worth not through words, but through action. Because when you are unshakable in your determination, recognition will find you. Vivien's journey is far from over, and even greater challenges await. Do you think she has what it takes to rise even higher? Share your thoughts and stay tuned for more incredible stories.